There is water at the edge of a quiet valley that no one will go near. It glows, a deep, impossible blue, lit from somewhere far beneath the stone. And the folk here have a rule, older than the church bell, older than fear has a right to be. Stay away from the blue spring. They say it's poison. They say nothing living will touch it. They say the last soul who tried walked off that ground and was never the same. And tonight, a girl with one coin in her fist and nowhere left in this world to go is kneeling at the edge of that glowing water, alone, cupping it in her hands, lifting it toward her lips. The whole valley is certain they have just seen the last of her. They have no idea what is about to begin. They called the valley the Hollow. A gentle place, mostly, good ground, and apple trees gone wild along the fence lines, mist in the mornings, thick as wool, wood smoke curling up in the evenings, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and the stories grow older than the people who tell them. But every gentle place keeps one dark corner, one thing it will not speak of above a whisper. And the dark corner of the hollow was that glowing pool at the foot of the eastern stone. The land around it had changed hands more times than anyone could rightly count. Each owner held it a little shorter than the one before. Each one walked off it a little poorer and a little quieter, shaking his head like a man who had touched something he wished he had let alone. So the warning got passed down, parent to child, for longer than the oldest fence post had stood leaning in the weeds. Stay away. Nothing grows there. Nothing good ever has. But the girl who knelt at that water had run out of places that would have her, and a person with nowhere left to go stops being afraid of the things that frighten everybody else. Her name was Della Mercer, and to understand why a girl with nothing in the world would walk straight toward the one thing a whole valley feared, you have first to understand what it is to have already lost the rest. She had been raised in a home for children with no families, a big, drafty house at the edge of a town some ways off, long rooms full of small iron beds, cold floors and quiet rules, and a clock that ticked too loud in the hall at night. It was a place where a child learned a hard thing early. That warmth is handed out carefully in small portions, and not to every child the same. Della was a thin girl, watchful, the sort who listened far more than she spoke. She had a habit of going perfectly still when a room got loud, the way a rabbit goes still in tall grass when a shadow passes over. She was easy to overlook, and mostly she was overlooked. But there was one woman in that place who saw her. One. The woman's name was Ada. Ada kept the kitchen garden behind the home. A plain, square-shouldered woman with strong hands and dark earth worked so deep into the creases of her knuckles that no amount of scrubbing took it out. She did not say much. She did not spend kindness lightly, or on those who would only let it run through their fingers. But she watched young Della the way a farmer watches weather rolling in over the hills, like she was reading something there, like she was waiting to see which way it would turn. And one cool spring morning, when the girl was small, Ada walked over, took her by the wrist, and pressed a paper packet of seeds into her open palm. "Let's see what your hands know," the woman said. That was the whole of it. No speech, no fuss, no promise of anything. But something in the girl woke up that morning that had been sleeping a long while. And it did not lie back down again. Ada taught her the soil, not the way a schoolmistress teaches a lesson off a board, but the way one weary soul hands another a secret she has carried a long time and grown tired of carrying alone. She taught the girl that dirt is not a dead thing, that it breathes, that it is crowded with life too small for the eye, all of it laboring, all of it part of one slow and steady conversation happening quietly beneath your feet. She taught her to read a leaf the way a doctor reads a face. Pale meant hungry. Yellow meant drowning. A curl along the edge meant the plant was thirsty and too proud to say so. And she taught her that a tomato will tell you the plain truth about your ground when nothing else on this earth will. Good dirt grows you a good tomato, Ada used to say, turning one slow in her rough palm, holding it up to the light like a jewel. And bad dirt grows you a lie. For year after year, that garden was the warmest place the girl had, the one square of the world where she was wanted, where her hands meant something, where a quiet, watchful child could kneel in the dark earth and feel for an hour at a time that she belonged somewhere. Then a hard winter came, and Ada took sick. It happened the way hard things tend to happen in the cold months, quietly, without much warning. One week the woman was bent over the cold frames, tucking straw around the young greens with her strong, dark hands. And the next, the bed lay empty, and the garden gate hung open in the wind, knocking soft against its post. And the girl who had at last found one safe corner of the world watched that corner go dark. Things changed at the home after that. The new woman who took over the garden had no patience for a girl who asked questions, who wanted to know the why beneath the how. The new matron had no use for a child who spent more of her hours with her hands in the soil than with a needle in her lap. A girl like that did not fit the order of things, and a place like that runs on order. So one gray morning, not long before her 17th year, they told Della Mercer that the time had come to make her own way in the world. There was no cruelty in the telling, no raised voices, just a few plain words, and a road waiting outside, and a small cloth bag holding everything she owned, which was not much. A change of clothes, worn thin, a comb missing half its teeth, a dented tin cup, a square of paper folded into a tight little knot, and one coin, one single coin, warm from the heat of her fist, because she had held on to it the whole long walk, gripped tight, the way a soul holds on to the last small proof that the world still owes them something, the last thin thread that says, "You are not yet down to nothing." She walked a long way, past towns that had no room for her, past faces that slid right over her as though she were made of window glass, past warm windows lit gold in the dusk, full of suppers she had not been asked to. And somewhere in all that walking, she came at last to a small office, low and dim, where a tired clerk sat behind a wooden counter. A stranger leaned in the doorway nearby, easy, unhurried, like a man who had nowhere better in the world to be, and knew it. The clerk looked up at the girl, at the dress 2 inches too short, because she had grown, and the cloth had not. At the bag that hung so light on her shoulder, it might have been empty. "What can a body get?" she asked him, and she set the coin down on the worn wood. "For this?" The clerk almost laughed, not unkindly, the way a man laughs when life lays something absurd across his counter on an ordinary afternoon. He ran a thick finger down the lines of a ledger. "One thing," he said at last, "and you won't be wanting it." He told her about a lot at the very back of the hollow. 2 acres, thin soil, rocky ground, a few stunted cedars that looked like they had spent their whole lives arguing with the wind and getting the worst of it. And a spring. "Blue water," he said, and here his voice dropped low, the way a voice does around a thing a person has decided to be afraid of. "Bad water. Cursed, some say. Nothing grows out there. Land sat empty 3 years and more, and not a soul sorry about it." That was when the stranger in the doorway chose to speak. He was a smooth sort of man, clean coat, brushed at the shoulders, a pleasant, open face, and an easy smile that seemed to arrive just a half second before it was needed, like he kept it ready in a pocket. "You'd do well to listen to him, child," the man said, soft, warm as fresh butter. "That ground out there will break a young heart in two. I'd surely hate to watch a girl spend her last coin buying herself a grief." His name was Silas Vane, and he said every word of it like a man handing over good and gentle counsel. But underneath the warmth, there was something else, something the girl could feel before she could name it, a small, cool flicker behind the eyes, the look of a card player who has already seen the whole of your hand and is only deciding now how kindly to take it from you. He told her not to buy the land. He told her twice. And then, when she pushed the coin across the counter just the same, it was Silas Vane himself who reached into his coat, drew out the folded deed, and slid it across the wood to her with that same easy smile. He had been holding it the entire time. The girl did not notice that then. She was too busy holding her breath, too busy with the size of what she was doing. She pressed her thumb against the paper to hold it flat. She signed her name slow, in careful, deliberate letters, the way a person signs a thing that matters. And just like that, with one warm coin and one held breath, Della Mercer became the owner of the single piece of ground in all the hollow that no other living soul wanted. It was a long walk out to the back of the valley. The road narrowed to a track. The track narrowed to a path worn down by the slow passing of cattle. And the path itself thinned out at last into nothing at all, the way things do at the ragged edge of a place that people have quietly agreed to forget. She came over a low rise just as the light was going to gold. And there it lay, her 2 acres, flat and pale and silent under the evening sky, the stunted cedars, the thin, struggling grass, the long wall of pale stone rising at the eastern edge, and at the foot of that stone, the spring. She stopped where she stood. Even from up on the rise, even in the failing light, the color of that water reached out across the distance and took hold of her. That deep, lit blue, glowing soft against the gray rock, like a single lamp left burning in the window of an empty house. It did not look like water. It looked like something a story would warn you about. The dark pool deep in the wood. The well the old witch points a crooked finger at and says, "Go on, drink, if you dare." The girl stood up on that rise a long while, the cool wind pulling at her too short dress. And she thought, for a moment, about turning back. But there was nothing behind her to turn back to. No bed waiting anywhere with her name on it. No door in the wide world that would open at her knock. No hands that would reach out and pull her in from the cold. The whole of her life now hung in the bag on her shoulder. and in the deed folded inside it, and in 2 acres of cursed ground, glowing blue in the dusk. So she squared her thin shoulders, and she walked down the slope, toward the one thing in all the world that now belonged to her. She made her camp that first night under a tarp strung between 2 leaning cedars. There was no cabin, no walls, no roof but the cloth. The last man to hold this ground had not troubled himself to build so much as a fence around it. He had taken one long look at the blue water and the gray, lifeless-looking earth, and he had walked away and not looked back. She gathered what dry wood she could find in the failing light. She coaxed a small fire to life. She ate the last heel of bread from the bottom of her bag, slow to make it last. And she watched the dark come down soft over the hollow. And then she heard it, the spring. In the daylight, she had not marked the sound of it. But now, with the fire burned low and the whole valley gone still around her, the sound rose up clear and close. A soft murmur, a patient run of water slipping over old stone. On and on it went, never hurrying, never pausing, as though it had been doing the same quiet thing for far longer than the town had stood, longer than the rule, longer than any soul now living could remember being told to fear it. It almost sounded like a voice, low, wordless, speaking gently to no one at all, in the dark. The girl lay awake a long while on the hard ground, listening to it, and for the first night in longer than she could rightly recall, she was not lonely in the usual hollow way, because something in this strange place was awake there with her, in the dark. She only did not yet know whether it wished her well or ill. Morning came pale and cold, gray light seeping up over the eastern stone. And in the daylight, the fears of the night before grew smaller. Hunger has a way of shrinking a body's fears down to a manageable size. Hunger and thirst. By the middle of the day, her tin cup had run dry. She had brought no water out with her. She had not thought that far ahead. A girl down to 1 coin does not have the luxury of planning for the day after tomorrow. And there it sat, 20 paces off, a whole stone basin full of it, blue, cold-looking, forbidden by every voice she had ever known. She knelt at the rim of the pool and looked down into it. The water was clear. That caught her by surprise. Clear all the way to the bottom, where small round stones lay scattered, coated in a fine pale dust that caught the light and sparkled faintly, like sugar. The blue was not in the stones, and not in the mud. The blue was somehow in the water itself, held there, the way color is held in a pane of colored glass. She lowered her hand toward it. The cold ran straight up her arm before she even touched the surface, and when she dipped her fingers in, it was so cold it came close to burning. She cupped a little in her palm and lifted it to her nose. It did not smell of rot. It did not carry the slick, low smell of metal or the sharp bite of sulfur or anything spoiled or wrong. It smelled of stone. Clean, deep, cold stone, drawn up from somewhere far down in the dark of the earth, and underneath that, faint as the edge of a half-remembered dream, something almost sweet. Every careful voice she had been raised on rose up in her at once and told her to stop. Ada would have struck the cup right out of her hand. You do not drink unknown water. You do not drink water that the animals turn away from. You do not drink water the color of a warning sign." But Ada was gone now, and the girl's head had begun to ache with thirst. And there was a small, stubborn thing alive in her, down beneath the fear. The very same thing that had made her sign her name when two grown men leaned over a counter and told her not to. A quiet, mulish little voice that said, "My own two senses are the one thing in this world that nobody has ever managed to take from me." She had spent her whole short life learning to read the soil, to trust her own hands, to know a true thing from a told thing, and everything she could see, and everything she could smell, and everything she could feel in the cold weight of that water told her it was clean. So she drank. The cold of it stole her breath clean away. It ached against her teeth. It sent a deep, sharp pain running down through her chest, so that she gasped out loud beside the pool. And then came the taste. Not the foul, sour taste of poison, not the slick wrongness of something gone bad in the dark. Sweet. Not sweet the way sugar is sweet. Sweet the way certain deep spring waters carry a sweetness up with them from far down in the rock. A clean, bright, mineral sweetness that she had no word for. It was the finest water that had passed her lips in the whole of her life. She knelt there at the rim of the pool, water running cold off her chin, and she waited. She waited for the burning, the sickness in her belly, the proof that all those frightened, careful voices had been right about this place from the start. The minutes went by. The valley stayed quiet around her. The sun crept a little ways across the pale face of the stone, and nothing came. No fever rising, no cramp doubling her over, no dark creeping in at the soft edges of her sight. Only the clean, cold ache of good water in an empty belly, and a strange, light feeling lifting slowly in her chest that it took her a long moment to put a name to. It was something close to wonder. She did not sicken. She did not die. That was the first thing the blue spring taught the girl. It did her no harm at all. The very thing the whole valley had feared for longer than its oldest memory. Let her be. But she did not understand it yet. Not the truth of it. She knew only that she had broken the oldest rule in the hollow with her own two hands, and the sky had not fallen. And for a girl who had lost the whole of everything, there was a strange and quiet courage waiting in that. A door easing open a crack. The first faint hint that perhaps the things she had been taught to fear and the things that could truly do her harm were not one and the same after all. She decided then to test the ground itself, because water a body can drink is one thing. But the tired clerk had said another thing, a thing that would not leave her be. Nothing grows there. If that held true, then this pretty place was a beautiful grave, and she would starve on it slow, with a glowing blue jewel for company. But if it did not hold true, she had carried one thing out of Ada's garden that no one had known about. A single small seedling, tucked into a tin can with holes punched through the bottom, its delicate roots wrapped up in a scrap of damp cloth, a young tomato plant, no taller than her own hand. The last living thing she had left of the one person who had ever looked her full in the face and seen something there worth the tending. She found a patch of ground near the spring where the slow overflow kept the earth dark and damp. She knelt. She worked the thin soil loose with her bare fingers, gently, the way she had been taught, and she set the seedling down into it. "Go on now," she murmured to it, soft, the way Ada used to speak to growing things. You tell me the truth about this place. She carried water up from the blue pool in her tin cup, and she poured it slow and careful around the small roots. Then she sat back on her heels in the damp dirt, and she waited. She did not have to wait for long. Within a handful of days, something began to happen. The seedling did not merely take hold. It did not just settle in and slowly find its feet, the patient way a young plant does, gathering itself for the long work of growing. It rose. The girl had grown things the whole of her short life. She knew well the ordinary pace of green and living things, the slow unfurling of a single leaf, the gradual thickening of a tender stem, the quiet, daily patience of it. This was something else entirely. By the close of the first week, the small plant had nearly doubled. The stem had thickened, firm and strong. The leaves had broadened and gone dark, deepening to a green so rich it looked almost wrong. A green so full, so deeply colored, that it seemed laid on by a painter's hand rather than grown up out of the dirt. The girl stood before it in the soft morning light, and the breath caught fast in her throat. She thought of the clerk's tired voice. Nothing grows there. She thought of Silas Vane's easy, butter-smooth smile. That ground will break a young heart in two. And she looked at this one small, fierce green thing, climbing up toward the open sky on land that the whole valley had given over for dead. And something bright and fierce woke up inside her chest. Hope, which is, perhaps, the most dangerous thing a soul who has lost everything can let back in through the door. She tended that plant as though it were the last small fire in the dead of winter. She watered it from the blue spring, morning and evening, slow and patient. She spoke to it low, the way Ada had taught her. She watched the roots spread out wide and strong through the loose, dark soil, with a vigor that came near to frightening her, as though the plant had been starving its whole life long, and had at last been led to a great and waiting feast. For 3 days, she let herself believe. She let herself dream the rest of it out. A green garden where there had been only stone. Food heaped and plentiful where there had been only a curse. A reason, at last, for a town to speak her name with warmth instead of with that old worn fear. She fell asleep that third night with the soft murmur of the spring filling her ears. And for the first time in a long, long while, she did not lie there dreading the morning. Perhaps she ought to have. She woke at first light, the way she had taught herself to, and she went out to greet the plant, and she stopped cold in her tracks. The tomato had fallen. In the dark of the night, all that bright, deep green had drained away. The broad leaves hung limp and dark, curling in tight upon themselves, like fists. The proud, strong stem had bent at the middle, as though something in its back had broken, and a black edge had crept up from the soil, spreading through the lowest leaves like dark ink, soaking slow into a clean cloth. It was dying. The strong, impossible, beautiful miracle of a plant was dying right there before her eyes, dying faster than it had ever grown. She dropped to her knees in the cold morning dirt. She reached out and touched one dark leaf, and it came away soft and ruined between her fingers. And all the bright hope of the last 3 days went sour and curdled inside her chest. The old voices came rushing back in a cold flood, the clerk, Silas Vane, the whole of the valley, going back generations, every grown soul who had ever taken a child by the shoulder and warned it away from this glowing, lying water. Maybe they had been right all along. Maybe the spring gave with the one hand only to take back with the other. Maybe it had let her drink in safety just to lull her. Maybe it had raised that plant up tall and proud and green only so that the falling would cut her deeper. Maybe the beauty truly was a lie, just exactly as they had all said. The girl knelt there in the dirt beside the dying plant, the last green gift of the one soul who had ever loved her, blackening now in the cold dawn. And for the first time since she had come over that rise, the full weight of how alone she truly was settled down upon her. Only the cold ground and the cursed water, and a small black ruin where her hope had stood the night before. She did not weep. She had learned a long time ago, in a long room full of small iron beds, that weeping changes not one single thing about the morning. She only knelt there as the pale sun climbed up over the hollow, and tried to reckon whether there was any reason left under heaven to stay. And that was the moment she felt it, the strange, prickling certainty, sudden as a cold draught, that she was not alone. She lifted her head. Across the spring, up on the low rise where she herself had first stood looking down on her land, there was a figure, an old man, still as the pale stone behind him, stooped a little in a long dark coat, with something flat and square balanced upon his knee. He was not coming closer. He was not calling out to her. He was not even staring at her exactly. He was looking at the water, and his hand was moving, slow, careful, the unmistakable patient motion of a man drawing, sketching the glowing blue pool the way a person sketches a thing he has traveled a very long road to lay his eyes upon. The girl rose slowly to her feet in the cold. "Who are you?" she called out across the water, her voice cracked and rough from the morning chill. "What is it you want out here?" The old man did not answer her. He raised his head. He looked at her, just the once, across the glowing blue water and the small black ruin lying at her feet. And there was something in that old weathered face that did not match a single thing she had been told about this place. Not fear, not warning, not the old tired dread of the valley folk. Something more like recognition, as though he had found, at long last, a thing that he had spent a great and patient stretch of his life searching for. He closed the flat board gently over his drawing. He lifted one hand and touched the brim of his hat to her, slow and grave and oddly courteous, the way a body nods to someone already known. And then he turned and walked back over the rise, unhurried, and he was gone from sight before she could cross the wet ground to him, before she could call out a single one of the questions rising hot and fast in her throat. The girl stood alone again beside her ruined plant. She did not understand this water that had quenched her thirst and then struck down her plant in the night. She did not understand the smooth, smiling man who had pressed that deed into her hands so very quickly. And she surely did not understand the old stranger up on the hill who had looked down at her cursed and worthless land. Not the way a person looks at a thing to be feared, but the way a person looks at a thing he had been hoping, for a very long time, that someone would finally come along and find. She knew only one thing, standing there in the thin and rising light, with everything lost and one small, stubborn ember still glowing low in her chest. She was not finished here. Not yet. She knelt back down in the cold, dark dirt, beside the dying plant, and with great care, with gentle fingers, she began to lift it free of the ground, because the soil had told her, plain as speech, that something here was wrong. And Della Mercer had spent the whole of her short and lonely life learning, more than anything else in the world, how to listen. The dead plant lay across her two open hands like a small broken thing, and the girl did not throw it away. That was the first sign of who Della Mercer truly was. Another soul in that cold gray morning, with hope gone sour and the whole valley proven right. Another soul would have flung the blackened plant into the weeds and walked off that cursed ground for good. She did not. She carried it back to her camp under the leaning cedars. She knelt. She laid it down gentle on a flat stone, the way you lay down something that still deserves a little care, even in its ruin. And then she began to study it. Because grief was one thing. Della knew grief. She had carried it a long road already. But underneath the grief, down where the watching, listening part of her lived, a quieter question had begun to stir. What killed you? She turned the plant over. She looked at the bent stem, the curled black leaves. And then she looked, careful, at the roots. And the roots told her a story she had not expected. They were not rotted. They were not soft and slimed the way roots go when a plant has drowned. They were not dry and withered the way they go when a plant has died of thirst. They were burned. The fine root hairs had gone dark and brittle at the tips, scorched almost, as though something far too strong had been poured straight onto them, day after day, and had eaten them alive from the bottom up. The girl sat back on her heels in the cold, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice she had not heard in a long while spoke up. Ada's voice. She remembered a morning in the old kitchen garden, years gone. She remembered being small and proud and pouring a whole heavy bucket of rich, dark compost tea over a row of young greens, certain she was doing them a great kindness. And she remembered Ada catching her wrist. "Easy, girl," the woman had said. "You can love a thing to death if you're not careful. Too much, too fast, too strong. That's a kind of harm, too, even when it's the good stuff. Especially when it's the good stuff." The girl knelt very still on her cursed ground, with the burned roots cradled in her hands, and slow, like the sun coming up. She began to understand. The water had not poisoned the plant. The water had fed it. It had fed it the way a feast feeds a starving man who has not eaten in a week. Too rich. Too much, all at once, so that the very thing meant to save him is the thing that strikes him down. She had carried that blue water up in her tin cup and poured it on, strong and straight from the spring, certain she was doing a kindness, and the kindness had been too much to bear. The plant had not grown so fast in spite of the water. It had grown that fast because of it. Because the water was rich beyond anything she had known. So rich that the roots had gorged and gorged, racing up green and glad toward the sky, until they burned. The girl let out a slow breath, and the morning, which had felt like an ending, began very quietly to feel like something else. A question. And questions, she had learned, are a kind of hope-wearing work clothes. She did not run to tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She simply got up off the ground and she went to work. Because a notion is just a story you tell yourself. But Ada had taught her something better than notions. Ada had taught her to ask the dirt, and let the dirt answer. So the girl made herself a small kingdom of rows. She had a little twist of seeds in her bag. Saved seeds, gathered with her own fingers from the old garden across the seasons, wrapped tight in a scrap of cloth, and carried out of that place the way you carry the only photographs of someone you love. She had guarded them close. Now she spent them like a gambler laying down her last coins. She marked out the rows in the damp ground near the spring. Careful, even, the way Ada had shown her, a lifetime ago. And then she did a thing that no one in the hollow had ever thought to do with that blue and frightening water. She tested it. In the first row, she planted her seeds and watered them the way she had watered the dead one, straight from the spring, strong, undiluted. The full, raw richness of it poured right onto the young roots. In the second row, she did something different. She took the blue water and she cut it down with plain rainwater she had caught in her tin cup and in a hollow of the rock, watered down, thin and gentle. Just a little of the rich blue stirred into the soft and ordinary rain. And in the third row, to be sure, to be honest, she used only the rainwater. No blue at all. 3 rows. The same seeds. The same ground. The same sun. And the same sky. 3 rows, and one quiet question buried in each of them. And then, the hardest part, she waited. Waiting is its own kind of courage. The world makes much of the courage it takes to act. It says less about the courage it takes to sit still on cold ground and trust that the answer is coming when every fear you own is whispering that you have wasted your last seeds on a dream. The girl waited. She watered, gentle and faithful, morning and evening. She watched the soil. She watched the sky. And one morning, near the end of the first week, she went out into the gray dawn, and the rows had begun to speak. The third row, the plain rainwater row, had come up. Small green shoots, ordinary and brave, just as a row of seeds should come up. Healthy, honest, nothing to remark upon. The first row, the strong, undiluted row, had come up too, and then begun already to fall. The same dark curl at the leaf edge, the same creeping black at the base, the very same death she had found at her feet that bitter morning, written again, plain as a confession. Too much, too rich, too soon. But the second row, oh, the second row. The girl stood over it in the thin light, and her hand rose slow to her mouth. The second row, where she had cut the blue water with the plane, where she had given the richness gently, a little at a time, mixed and mild and patient. The second row was lifting itself toward heaven, taller already than the plain row beside it, the stems thicker, the leaves broader and darker, gleaming with a deep and living green that the rainwater row, for all its honest health, simply did not have. It was growing fast, but not too fast. Not the doomed, racing sprint of the burned ones. It was growing strong. The girl sank down onto her knees between the rows. And there, on the cursed and worthless ground that the whole valley had given up for dead, with the blue spring murmuring soft behind her, Della Mercer understood the secret that had hidden in plain sight for longer than the town had stood. The water was not a curse. The water had been waiting on someone wise enough to use it gently. The cattle that bawled and turned away. The owners who walked off poorer. The frightened grown folk and their hard old rule. They had all been right that the raw, undiluted water did harm. They had simply taken that one true thing and built a whole false story on top of it. They had decided the gift was a poison, when the truth was only this: a gift given too strong can wound, and the very same gift, given with care, can raise the dead ground up green. The girl knelt there a long while between the falling row and the rising one, and something moved through her chest that she had no name for, something between grief and joy. The particular ache of a soul who has just discovered that the thing she lost and the thing she has found were closer kin than anyone could have guessed. Too much, too fast, she murmured to the empty valley. To Ada, maybe. Even when it's the good stuff. And then, for the first time in a long while, she smiled. After that, the garden became a kind of miracle that the girl built with her own 2 hands. She tended those rows the way a body tends the thing it has been waiting its whole life to be allowed to love. She learned the water, its moods, and its measure, how much to cut it and when, how to give the young plants only a whisper of the rich blue, and the older ones a little more, as they grew strong enough to take it. She learned the way you learn a language, not from a book, but from living inside it day after day until it becomes your own. And the ground answered her. The thin, rocky soil began to change. She could see it happening. The pale gray dirt grew darker, week on week, as the rich water worked down into it. Earthworms appeared, fat and pink, in earth that had lain near lifeless. The whole bed seemed to wake up and start breathing, the way Ada had always said good soil does. The plants rose, not the doomed sprint of that first burned seedling, but a strong and steady climbing, green and glad and sure. The bean vines reached up their poles like they were trying to touch the sky. The corn stood tall and broad-leafed and dark, and the tomatoes were something out of a dream. They grew heavy and round and deeply red, going on toward purple at the shoulders. Bigger than any the girl had grown in the old garden. Bigger than any she had seen at any market table. And one warm evening, she picked the first ripe one. She sat down on a flat stone by the spring, with the blue water glowing soft beside her in the dusk, and she bit into it, and the juice ran down her chin. And the taste stopped her cold. It was not just a tomato. It was every tomato. It was the whole bright idea of a tomato, made real at last after a lifetime of pale imitations. Deep and sweet and sharp and alive, so full and so complex that her mind could scarcely take hold of it as a real thing. She sat there on the stone in the falling dark, and she laughed, out loud, alone, the sound of it startling a bird up out of the cedars, not from joy, though there was joy in it, from shock, from the pure, head-spinning shock of tasting a thing so far past what she had believed was possible that her body had no other way to answer it but to laugh. The cursed ground had given her a feast. And the bees came. That was a thing she had not looked for. They came in numbers she had never witnessed, finding the garden from somewhere far off, crawling over the blossoms with a kind of hunger, a kind of joy, as though the flowers on this strange ground offered them something they had been searching the whole valley to find. The girl stood in the middle of it one bright morning, the hum of the bees all around her, the deep green of the rose, the glow of the spring, the heavy red fruit hanging thick on the vines. And she thought, with a wonder that bordered on disbelief, she was not starving on this ground. She was living on it. The first person to find out was a boy. He came one afternoon out of the tree line at the edge of her 2 acres, a slingshot in his back pocket, a half-grown look about him, the kind of boy who roams the whole valley because the whole valley is his. His name was Tom. He had heard, the way boys hear things, that there was a girl living out at the cursed end of the hollow, alone, on the bad blue water. He had come to see if it was true. He had expected, maybe, to find a sad and hungry thing, a cautionary tale he could carry home. Instead, he came out of the trees, and he stopped like he had walked into a wall. He stood at the edge of the green, and he stared at the corn, tall and tasseling, at the bean vines climbing for the sky, at the tomato plants staked and heavy, taller than the girl herself, hung thick with fruit so red it looked unreal. On the one piece of land in the whole valley, where by every story he had been raised on, not so much as a weed was meant to grow. "What?" the boy said slowly, when he found his voice. "Did you do to the dirt?" The girl looked up from her work. "Nothing," she said. "I only listened to it." The boy's eyes went to the spring, to the glowing blue water that his own mother had warned him away from since before he could walk. "You used the bad water," he said, half a question, half an accusation. "I used the water," the girl answered, gentle. "There was nothing bad in it, only in how folks used it." The boy looked at her a long moment, at the garden, at the spring, and then he turned and ran, the way boys run when they are carrying news too big to hold. He told his father. His father, frowning, walked out the next day to see for himself, and stood at the edge of the green with his hat in his hands, and a strange look on his face. He told the neighbors, and so it began, the slow, disbelieving pilgrimage of the hollow, out to the back of the valley, to the cursed ground, to see the girl who had grown a garden where a garden could not be. They came in 2s and 3s, hard-handed farmers, tired wives. They stood at the edge of her land, and they looked, and most of them did the same thing. They shook their heads, because a thing you have believed your whole life does not give way easily. It does not fall the first time it is shown to be false. It digs in. It argues. It calls the truth a trick. "That water's been there since before my grandpap," one old farmer said, turning a fat red tomato over and over in his rough hands like it might be a trap. "And it was bad water then, and it's bad water now. My daddy told me so. His daddy told him. His name was Renner. He was the hardest of them, the oldest, the one who had carried the valley's fear the longest, and who had warned the most children over the most years away from that glowing blue pool. And he stood there at the edge of her garden, holding a tomato grown on the very water he had feared his whole life long, and his certainty was a wall around him. The girl did not argue with him. She had learned somewhere along her hard road that you cannot argue a person out of a thing they have decided to fear. You can only hand them the truth and let them taste it for themselves. "Go on," she said quietly. It won't hurt you. I give you my word." For a long moment, the old man did not move. And then, maybe to prove her wrong, maybe just to end the thing, old Renner lifted the tomato to his mouth, and he bit into it, and the whole valley, it seemed, went still around him. He chewed slow. He swallowed. And something happened in that hard old weathered face. Something gave way. A wall, leaning on its foundations for longer than anyone could remember, found at last that the ground beneath it had shifted. He did not say it was good. He did not say it was the finest he had eaten, though it was. He stood there, the juice on his chin, looking at the girl with an expression she would come to know well in the seasons ahead. The particular, undone look of a person whose lifelong certainty has just been taken apart by a piece of fruit. And what he said, low and rough, was not about the tomato at all. "Girl," he said, "where did you learn to do this?" And the question landed somewhere deep in her chest, because no one had asked her that in a long, long while. No one had looked at her hands and her green rose and seen something worth the asking. "From a woman who's gone now," the girl said softly. "She told me the dirt was alive. I just believed her, is all." Old Renner looked at her for a moment longer. Then he gave a single slow nod, the way a man nods when he has decided to lay down a thing he has carried too long. And he turned and walked back the way he had come, the half-eaten tomato still in his hand. And the girl understood that something in the hollow had changed that afternoon. Quietly, the way the biggest things change. But the change that mattered most was still walking toward her. He came on a still evening when the others had gone. A young man, lean and quiet, with a careful way of moving, like a person who builds things and has learned to measure twice before he cuts. There was sawdust on his sleeve and a stillness about him that the girl liked at once, without knowing why. His name was Eli Booker. He had tasted one of her tomatoes at the Crossroads store, where folks had begun, shyly, to trade for them. And the taste of it had set something turning over in him. And he had walked the long road out to the back of the valley, not to gawk and not to argue, but only to see the place where such a thing could be true. He did not say much. That suited her. He stood at the edge of the green, and he looked out over the rows in the gold of the evening light. And then his eyes found the spring, glowing soft blue at the foot of the pale stone. And he did a thing that no grown soul in the hollow had done in living memory. He walked toward it, slow, unafraid. He went and knelt at the rim of the basin, the way a person kneels at something that deserves respect. And he reached out, and he put his hand down into the cold blue water, and he held it there. For a long moment, he did not speak. "It's beautiful," he said at last, quiet, almost to himself. All this time, and it was beautiful. He looked up at her, his hand still in the water. Why was everybody so afraid of it? And the girl came and stood beside him at the edge of the glowing pool. "Because it was different," she said softly. And folks get taught, somewhere along the way, to be afraid of different. They call it being careful. But mostly, it's just being afraid. Eli Booker looked at her then. And it was a different kind of looking than she had grown used to in this life. Not the looking that slides over a person like she is made of glass. Not the looking that warns or pities or wants something. He looked at her the way you look at someone you have decided to know. And something in the girl, some small cold place that had been clenched shut for a long, long time, eased open just a little in the warmth of it. She had spent her whole life being the one nobody stayed for. And here, in the blue evening, on her cursed and blooming ground, was a quiet man in no apparent hurry to leave. For the first time in longer than she could rightly remember, Della Mercer felt the strange, fragile, frightening beginnings of a thing she had given up on. She felt like she might belong somewhere. That night, alone under her cedars with the spring murmuring in the dark, she could not sleep. Her heart was too full. With the garden, with the old man's question, with the memory of a quiet man's hand in the blue water, and the way he had looked at her. And in that full and sleepless dark, she reached into her bag, and she took out the last thing she owned of the woman who had started all of this. A square of paper, folded into a tight little knot. She had carried it the whole long road, through every cold town, through every closed door. She had held it on the nights when the loneliness pressed down hardest, the last small proof that someone, once, had thought her worth the teaching. She had never opened it. She had been half afraid of what it might say, or might not say. But tonight, with her heart so full and the blue light glowing soft beyond the tarp, the girl unfolded it at last. Careful, her fingers trembling just a little in the dark, and the breath went out of her. It was a drawing, an old drawing, the paper soft and worn at the creases from years of folding, done in a careful, patient hand, in faded gray pencil, a drawing of a spring, water rising from a crack in a wall of pale stone, a stone basin no wider than a wagon. And though the paper held no color, the artist had marked it here and there with a single faded word written small along the water's edge: blue. The girl sat very still in the dark, the old drawing shaking gently in her hands. It was this spring, her spring, the cursed and glowing pool at the foot of her stone, drawn long ago by someone who had stood right where she now stood and looked at this same water and not been afraid of it. Ada had been here, the woman who taught her the soil, the one soul who had ever seen something in her worth the tending. Ada had walked this very ground once in some season long gone. Ada had knelt at the rim of this same blue water, and she had not run from it. She had drawn it, and she had kept the drawing. And then, across all the years and all the distance, she had handed it to a thin and watchful orphan girl, folded into a tight little knot, without a single word of what it was, as though she had known, as though she had been pointing the way home all along. And a half memory stirred in the girl then. Ada, years back, by the cold frames in the dusk, murmuring of a blue water in a hollow far off, a place she had loved and lost. The girl had been too small to hold the words, and they had slipped away from her like most small things do. But something in her, it seemed, had been holding them all along. The girl pressed the old paper to her chest in the dark, and her eyes burned. She thought of the old man on the hill, the stranger with the flat board on his knee, sketching this same blue water, looking at her ruined ground with recognition in his weathered face, as though he too had been here before, as though he too had been waiting. She had come to this place believing she was no one, from nowhere, wanted by no one. A girl who had spent her last coin on the one piece of ground that no living soul desired, by pure blind chance. But chance does not draw a picture and fold it into a child's bag. Chance does not whisper of a far-off hollow to a girl too small to remember, and then send her, years on, to the very water in the picture. The girl sat awake in the blue dark a long while, the spring murmuring its old and patient song, the worn drawing held against her heart. And for the first time in the whole of her lonely life, she did not feel alone. She felt called. She did not understand it yet, not all of it. She did not yet know who had drawn the path, or why, or what still waited up ahead in the seasons to come. But she understood this much. Kneeling there in the glow of the spring, her own dead teacher had loved before her. She had not stumbled onto this ground by accident. She had been brought home, and out beyond the firelight, beyond the green rose and the glowing water, in a fine warm house in the heart of the valley, a smiling man named Silas Vane had begun, very quietly, to hear the news. The news that the cursed and worthless ground he had been so glad to sell to a friendless girl for a single coin had begun, against every story he had ever told, to grow. The trouble with a miracle is that other people always want a piece of it. The girl did not understand that yet. She was too happy. For a little while, that summer, the cursed end of the hollow became the brightest corner of the whole valley. The garden poured out its bounty faster than one pair of hands could gather it. Tomatoes and beans and corn and squash, heaped in baskets, more food than a single soul could ever eat. So she gave it away. That was the kind of girl she was. She had gone hungry too many times to hoard a thing while a neighbor went without. She carried baskets to the crossroads store and left them for folks to take. She filled jugs from the spring, cut and gentled the way she had learned, and lined them up for the home gardeners of the hollow who wanted to try a little of the blue water on their own thin plots. And the valley began to change. Gardens that had limped along for years in the rocky ground started to lift their heads. Beans climbed where beans had sulked. Tomatoes swelled where tomatoes had stayed small and sour. Old Renner himself, the hardest doubter of them all, came back one morning with his hat in his hands and asked, gruff and shy, if he might trouble her for a jug or two. She gave him 3, and she would not take his coin. A woman taught me this for free, she told him. I mean to do the same. And for those few golden weeks, it seemed the hollow had remembered how to hope. The girl moved through her days with dirt under her nails and the sun on her back, and a quiet man named Eli stopping by most evenings, building her things she had not asked for. A proper gate, a bench by the spring, a little channel of fitted stone to carry the water gentle to the rose. She had a garden. She had a purpose. She had, for the first time, the beginnings of a place that felt like hers. She should have known. A girl who has lost everything once learns, somewhere deep in her bones, that the world has a way of noticing when you finally have something worth taking. And down in the heart of the valley, in a fine warm house with brushed coats hanging by the door, a smiling man had been listening. He came on a bright afternoon, in a good buggy, with that easy smile already in place. Silas Vane. He climbed down at the edge of her green and stood there a moment, taking it all in. The heavy vines, the tall corn, the glowing blue spring at the foot of the pale stone, and the girl, sun-browned and strong now, straightening up from her work to meet him. "Well," he said, soft and warm as ever, "would you look at what you've done out here?" He walked the rows with her, admiring everything, praising her hands, her gift, her grit. He was charming. He was kind. He was the very picture of a good man come to say, "Well done." And then, gentle as folding a napkin, he got to it. "A girl like you," he said, "shouldn't have to break her back out here on the hard end of the valley. All this work, all this worry. It's a hard life for a young thing all alone." He turned to her, and the smile widened, and his voice dropped to the soft and reasonable tone of a man offering a great kindness. "Let me take it off your hands." The girl went still. "I'll give you a fair price," Silas went on. "More than fair. More money than you've held in your whole life, child. You could go anywhere. Start fresh. Buy yourself a real future, instead of grubbing in the dirt out here at the edge of nowhere." He named a sum, and it was a fortune. To a girl who had come over that rise with a single coin in her fist, it was a sum so large it did not seem like a real number at all. For one long moment, the girl let herself feel the weight of it, the ease it offered, the safety. And then she looked past Silas Vane's smiling face, to the garden, to the spring, to the bench Eli had built, and the gate, and the dark soil she had coaxed back to life with her own two hands, to the place that had finally felt like home. "No," she said. The word came out quiet, but it did not waver. "Thank you," she said, "but it isn't for sale, not at any price." And that was the moment the smile slipped. It was only a small thing, a flicker, the corner of his mouth tightening, the warmth draining out of his eyes like water out of a cracked cup. But the girl saw it, and in that flicker, she understood that the man before her had not come out to the back of the valley to do her a kindness. He had come to collect on something. "You don't understand," Silas said, and his voice had changed now. The butter was gone out of it. "You don't understand what you're sitting on." "I think I do," the girl said softly. "Better than you, maybe." The smile came back then. But it was a different smile, a thin, cold thing that did not reach the eyes at all. "No, child," Silas Vane said. "You really don't." And then he told her. He told her the way a man tells a thing when he has decided he no longer needs to hide it. With a kind of pride, a kind of pleasure even. He told her that he had known about the water for a long, long time, that his family had known, that the story of the curse, the bad water, the cattle that bawled and turned away, it was a true story, in its bones. The raw water did harm, used wrong. But somewhere along the years, the Vanes had come to suspect there was more to it than that under the fear there might be something of great worth. The trouble was the risk. The trouble was the fear, which his own family had been content to let grow, season after season. A man of standing could not be seen sinking money and his good name into cursed ground. If it failed, he would be the fool who chased a witch's water. He would be ruined. What he needed was someone else to try it first. Someone with nothing to lose. Someone no one would miss, and no one would mourn, if the cursed water did to her what the story said it would. Someone desperate enough to spend her last coin on the one piece of ground a careful man would never touch. And he had not left it to luck. He had quietly bought up the high ground above her land seasons ago, where the water came down out of the hills. Whoever owned the worthless lot, he would own the road her water rode in on. He had been holding that deed in his coat, the girl remembered now, before she had said a single word. He had been waiting for someone exactly like her to walk through that door. "You were the experiment," Silas Vane said almost gently. "And you passed. You proved the water could be tamed. You proved there's a fortune sitting at the bottom of that pretty blue pool. And now," he spread his hands, "now it's time for grown folks to take over." The girl stood very still in her own green garden and felt something cold move through her. She had been used. The land had not come to her by chance or by mercy. It had come to her because a smiling man had looked at a friendless girl and seen a thing he could spend. A test? A risk run on someone else's life so that his would stay safe. "Sell it to me," Silas said. "Take the money. Walk away. Because one way or another, child, that water is going to belong to me." The girl lifted her chin, and though her heart was pounding, though the old cold loneliness was rising up in her throat, she met his eyes and did not look away. "It doesn't belong to you," she said. "It doesn't belong to me either. Water like that. It belongs to itself, and to anyone willing to use it kindly." Silas Vane looked at her a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and climbed up into his fine buggy and looked down at her from on high. "We'll see," he said, and he drove away, and the girl stood alone in her garden in the warm gold light, with a cold stone settling in her chest, because she had seen the look in his eyes as he left. And it was the look of a man who had decided that if he could not buy a thing, he would simply take it. The taking did not come the way she expected. It did not come with rough men or papers or a sheriff at her gate. It came with whispers. The girl began to notice it slow. The neighbors who had come out with their hats in their hands, who had taken her tomatoes and her jugs of blue water with grateful eyes. They began to stop coming. The children who had run the long path out to her garden, laughing, jugs swinging from their hands, stopped appearing at the tree line. The baskets she left at the Crossroads store sat untouched now. Folks walked past them. Folks looked away. And then, one afternoon, old Renner came out to see her. Just Renner. And he stood at the edge of her green, twisting his hat, and he could not quite meet her eye. "There's talk," he said. "What kind of talk?" the girl asked, though something in her already knew. Renner looked at the spring, at the glowing blue water that he had feared his whole life, and then learned to trust, and now looked afraid of all over again. "That the water's bewitched," he said heavily. "That no honest ground gives like this. That it ain't natural what grows out here. That a girl who can raise the dead earth with cursed blue water is a thing folks ought to be careful of." He swallowed. "They're saying you bewitched it," he said, "or it bewitched you, and that no good will come to the valley for taking food from a witch's garden." The girl felt the words land in her like cold stones dropping into a well. A witch. She knew where the talk had come from. She did not have to ask. She could see the smiling man's hand in every word of it, the way you can see a hand in a shadow puppet on the wall. Silas Vane had found the one tool that would work on the hollow, the oldest tool there was: fear. He could not buy the water from her. So instead, he was poisoning the one thing she had that mattered more than the water. He was taking away her people. You believe that, Renner? The girl asked quietly. After you tasted it? After your own garden lifted up its head? The old man's jaw worked. No, he said at last. No, I don't. But, he looked down at his twisting hat. But folks are scared, girl. And scared folks, they don't think with their tongues. They think with their bellies. And right now, their bellies are telling them to keep their young ones home. He met her eyes then, just for a moment, with something like shame. I'm sorry, he said. And he turned and walked back the long path. An old man bent under the weight of a fear he did not even believe. And the girl was alone again. It is a particular kind of cruelty to give a person a taste of belonging and then take it away. The girl had known loneliness her whole life, the cold beds, the closed doors, the faces that slid past her like she was made of glass. She had survived all of it. But she had survived it because she had not known any better, because she had no memory of warmth to measure the cold against. This was different. Now she knew what it felt like to be welcomed, to have neighbors come with their hats in their hands, to have a boy run laughing to her gate, to have an old man ask, "Where did you learn this?" To belong to a place, and to have it taken back, one whispered word at a time, was a wound that the old loneliness had never been. She moved through her garden in those days like a ghost. The bounty still came. The vines still climbed. But the joy had gone out of it. What good is a feast when there is no one left to share it with? And in the dark of those nights, the old fear came creeping back. The fear that had lived in her since she was small. You don't belong anywhere. The minute you let yourself believe you found a home, the world will remind you that homes are for other people, not for you. She began, in those low nights, to think about leaving. And then Silas Vane made his last move. It came on a gray morning. The girl woke before dawn, the way she did, and she went out to the spring to begin the day's watering, and she stopped at the edge of the basin, and her blood ran cold. The water had dropped. The pool that had brimmed full and glowing since before the town had a name had fallen. There was a ring of wet stone around the edge now, where the water had pulled back. And the flow from the crack in the rock, that patient, steady murmur that had been the music of her every night, had slowed to a trickle, and the blue, the deep, glowing, lit from within blue that had frightened a valley and saved a girl, was fading, going pale, going gray, going dim like a lamp running low on oil. The girl stood frozen at the edge of her dying spring, and she could not understand it. The spring had run since before memory. What could stop a thing like that? What could reach down into the deep stone and choke off water that had flowed for an age? And then she remembered. The high ground, the place above her land, up the slope, where the spring was fed from somewhere far back in the hills. The very ground Silas Vane had bought up seasons before she ever signed her name. One way or another, he had said, that water is going to belong to me. If he could not have it, he would make certain that no one could. The girl went up the slope at a run, her heart slamming. And near the top, where her own land ended and the wild hills began, she found it. A dam, rough and raw and new. earth and stone and timber, thrown up across the high channel where the water came down to feed her spring. Men's work, done fast and done cruel. The water that should have flowed down to her pool now pooled uselessly behind the barrier, or ran off wasted into the rocks, diverted away to nowhere. He had not stolen the spring. He had murdered it. If he could not own the blue water, then he would choke it off at the source and let the cursed ground go back to being cursed ground, and let the witch girl's garden wither and die, and let the whole valley remember why they had feared that place to begin with. And then, in a season or two, when the green was gone, and the fear was strong, and the girl was driven off, he could tear down his own dam and let the water rise again on land that belonged, at last, to him. The girl stood at the foot of that ugly dam, and the truth of it broke over her like cold water. She could not fight this. She had no men, no money, no law that would hear her, no neighbors who would stand at her side, not now, not with the word witch hanging in the air. She had a garden already beginning to wilt for want of the water Silas had stolen. She had a spring going gray. She had nothing. The way she had come into this valley with nothing. And in that moment, standing alone at the foot of the thing that was killing her dream, the old fear finally won. "What did you expect?" the cold voice whispered. "You? A home? A place that was yours? You were never anything but a thing to be used and thrown away." Silas Vane saw that the first day. He saw it clearer than you ever did. Go. Pack your bag. Leave before they drive you out, the way you've always known they would. The girl walked back down the slope in a fog. She went into her camp. She took up her old cloth bag, the bag she had carried over the rise so long ago, and she began, with shaking hands, to pack. She did not hear him come. She only heard his voice, quiet, even, from the edge of the green. "Where do you think you're going?" The girl turned. Eli Booker stood there in the gray morning, sawdust on his sleeve, looking at the bag in her hands. "I have to go," she said, and her voice cracked on it. "He's won, Eli. He's choked the spring. The garden's dying. They think I'm a witch. There's nothing left for me. There never was." She heard the old words come out of her own mouth. There never was. The lie she had been told her whole life, by every cold room and closed door, until she had finally started telling it to herself. Eli crossed the green to her, slow, steady, the way he did everything, and he reached out and put his hand over hers, over the worn strap of the bag, and he stopped her. "You came here with nothing," he said quietly, "and you made all of this out of dirt and stubbornness and a thing nobody else in this whole valley had the nerve to try. You didn't run from the cursed water. You didn't run from old Renner and his hard head. You didn't run from any of it." He ducked his head and made her look at him. "Don't you run now," he said, "not from a coward with a shovel and a lie." The girl's eyes burned. "I've always been alone in it," she whispered. "Every time. Every single time it mattered. There was never anybody who stayed." Eli Booker held her gaze. "Then this is the time that's different," he said, "because this time you're not alone. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." The girl stood there in the gray light, the bag heavy in her hands, the old fear and the new hope at war in her chest, and slowly she set the bag down. It was not much. It was one quiet man, with no money and no power, and a hand over hers. But it was the first time in the whole of her life that someone had looked at her in the worst hour and chosen to stay. And it was enough to keep her standing. The next morning, the old stranger came back. She had near forgotten him, the figure on the hill from her first lonely days, the old man with the flat board on his knee, sketching the blue water, looking at her ruined ground with something like recognition. He came walking up the path slow, leaning on a stick, his long coat dusty from the road. And he stopped at the edge of her dying garden, and he looked at the failing spring, the pale gray water, the wilting rose, and his old face filled with sorrow. "I was afraid of this," he said. "I came as fast as these old legs would carry me." The girl came toward him, wary, tired. "Who are you?" she asked. The same question she had called across the water on that first ruined morning. "What do you want here?" The old man looked at her for a long moment. "My name is Holloway," he said, "and I have spent the better part of a long life studying water and stone, where it comes from, what it carries, why some of it does the strange things it does." He gestured at the fading spring. "There is no witchcraft in that water, child," he said gently. "I could have told this whole foolish valley that a long time ago. The blue is a thing the water gathers, deep down, passing through a certain kind of rich stone far below us. It carries up the very things a growing plant hungers for. It is not a curse. It is closer to the opposite of a curse." He shook his head slowly. "Given raw, it overwhelms. Too rich, too strong, it burns. That much the old fear got right. But given gently, given with a wise and patient hand," he looked at her green and wilting rose, and something like wonder crossed his weathered face. "It does exactly what I have watched you do. It raises the dead ground up to life." The girl stared at him. "You knew," she said slowly. "All this time, somebody knew the truth, and let this valley go on being afraid?" The old man's face creased with an old grief. "Somebody tried to tell them," he said. "Long ago, before your time, a young woman with strong hands and a gift for the soil. She knelt at this very spring, and she learned its secret, just as you did, and she tried to give that truth to this valley as a gift." The girl went utterly still, and the valley, Holloway said softly, did to her what frightened places do to anyone who shows them they've been wrong. They turned on her. They called her things. There were men, then, with an interest in keeping that water feared and cheap, the same as there are now. And they drove her off this ground and out of this valley, and she carried her gift away to other gardens, in other places, far from here. He looked at the girl, and his eyes were wet. "Her name was Ada," he said, and the world seemed to stop turning. The girl could not speak. Her hand rose to the worn drawing folded against her heart, the drawing of this very spring, done in a careful, patient hand. Ada, the woman who had taught her the soil, the one soul who had ever seen something in her worth the tending. Ada had stood here. Ada had knelt at this water and learned its secret and tried to give it away, and been driven off for her kindness. And then, across all the years, she had folded a drawing of this place into a child's bag without a word, and whispered of a far-off hollow to a girl too young to keep the words, and pointed a lost child home. Not by chance, not by accident. She had sent Della back to finish what a frightened valley had not let her begin. She spoke of you near the end, Holloway said gently. A watchful girl, she said, with good hands and a stubborn heart. She hoped you'd find your way somewhere you could grow. I have been looking for this spring a long while, child. I promised an old friend I'd see it through. And when I came over that rise and saw a girl kneeling at the blue water, unafraid. He smiled, sad and warm. I knew her gift had found its way home. The girl stood in the gray morning with tears running freely down her face. Not the tears of grief she had refused herself for so long. Different tears. The tears of a person who learns, all at once, that she was never as alone as she believed. That a hand had been on her shoulder the whole long road, guiding, hoping, believing. The dam, she managed at last. He's choked the spring. Holloway, if the water doesn't come back. The old man's face hardened. That dam, he said, is the work of a frightened, greedy man who understands stone even less than this valley understands water. He thinks he can own a thing that rises from the deep heart of these hills. He thinks because he's thrown up some earth and timber on the high ground, the water belongs to him. He shook his head. But water like this does not belong to the man who dams it. It rises from beneath the feet of every soul in this valley. It is older than his family and his fences and his lies. And if that dam stands much longer, it will not just kill your garden, child. It will choke the source itself and rob this whole valley of a gift it never even knew it had. He looked at her, and his old eyes burned. But it can still be saved. The water is only dammed. It is not dead. Tear down that wall, and the spring will rise again, blue and strong as it ever was. The girl looked from the old man to the fading spring, to the quiet man standing steady at her side, and something rose up in her chest that was bigger than her fear. She had come into this valley with one coin and a folded drawing and a wound where her belongings should have been. She had been used, whispered about, cast out, driven nearly to running. But she was not alone. She had a quiet man who had chosen to stay. She had an old stranger who carried a promise. She had a hard-headed farmer down the valley who, deep down, did not believe the lie. And she had a debt to a woman with strong hands, a debt of truth that a frightened valley had kept her from paying a long, long time ago. The girl wiped the tears from her face, and she stood up straight. "Then we tear it down," she said. And for the first time, the fear in her chest had gone quiet. And in its place was something that felt very much like the beginning of a war worth fighting. The war the girl had braced for did not look like a war at all. It began with one old man and a long walk down into the valley in the gray light before the sun. Holloway would not let her go alone, and Eli would not let her go without him. So the three of them set out together that morning, down the long path from the cursed end of the hollow toward the heart of the valley, where the whispers had done their patient work, and the doors had quietly closed, one after another. The girl's stomach was a hard knot the whole way down. She was walking back toward the very people who had turned their faces from her, the ones who had called her a thing to be feared, the ones who had kept their children home and let their baskets sit untouched on the crossroads store's worn floor. She did not know what she would find waiting in those closed houses, but she knew where she had to begin. She began with Renner. The old farmer came out onto his porch when he saw the three of them coming up his lane, and his weathered face went through a whole season of feeling in the space of a single breath. Shame first, then worry, and then, underneath all of it, something the girl chose to trust, a flicker of plain relief. The relief of a man who has been carrying a guilt he does not know how to set down and has just seen, coming up his lane, the one person who might let him lay it aside. She did not waste her words on him. "Come and see what your good neighbor's been doing up on the high ground," she said. "Come and see what's truly been choking my spring. And then you can tell me, Renner, which one of us this valley ought to be afraid of." For a long moment, the old man did not move. He stood on his porch with his coffee going cold in his hand, and the weight of his choosing sat heavy on him. Then Holloway stepped forward, leaning on his stick, and he looked the old farmer square in the eye. "There is no witch in this valley, friend," the old stranger said, and his voice carried the quiet, unshakable weight of a long life and a hard-won certainty. "There is a frightened place, and there is a greedy man who learned a long time back how to use that fear like a tool in his hand. I have studied water and stone the better part of my years, and I will stake what's left of them on the plain truth of what I am telling you now." He gestured back up the slope toward the cursed end of the hollow. "Come and look," he said simply. "That is the whole of what an honest man can ask of another. Just come and look with your own two eyes." And something in the old farmer's chest gave way at last. He set his cold coffee down on the porch rail. He reached back inside his door for his hat, and he came. They went from farm to farm after that, the four of them now. The girl and the quiet carpenter and the old man who knew the truth of the water, and Renner walking beside them, lending the weight of his gray hairs and his good name to a cause he had been too afraid to claim a week before. And at every door, the same thing happened. Holloway spoke his plain and steady piece. The girl let them see her face, the face of the witch they had been taught to dread, in the flesh at last. And it was a tired girl's face after all, sun-browned and weary and human, a face that had wept and gone hungry and hoped, nothing in it to fear. And one by one, the folk of the hollow came out of their houses, not because the fear left them all at once. Fear is a stubborn lodger. It does not pack its bags and leave the moment it is shown the door. They came because, underneath the fear, most of them still remembered. They remembered the tomatoes that had made grown men go quiet and strange. They remembered their own tired gardens lifting up their heads for the first time in years. They remembered a thin girl who had filled their jugs at the spring and would not take a single coin for it. They remembered the bounty. And when a soul has tasted a thing that good and then been told to call it poison, some quiet, stubborn part of that soul keeps wanting to trust its own tongue over the whispers. So they came, with their hats in their hands and shame heavy on their faces. A small handful at first, then a dozen, then more than a body could easily count. And the girl turned and led them all back up the long slope, to the high ground, to the dam. She did not have to say a single word when they reached it. The dam said it all for her. There it stood, raw and ugly in the morning light. Fresh-cut timber, piled stone, A crude wall thrown up fast across the high channel, where the water had come down to feed her spring since before the town had a name. And the valley folk gathered at the foot of it, and they looked, and they understood. There was the truth, laid out plain in stolen timber and heaped rock. No witchcraft, no curse, no wrath of some bewitched water against a town that had dared to take its fruit. Just a wall that a frightened, greedy man had built to choke the life out of a girl's dream, so that he might buy it back for a coin, and call the miracle his own. Old Renner walked up to that dam, slow, and laid his rough hand flat against the raw timber. And his jaw worked, and his eyes went bright and hard. Then he turned to face the others, and his voice came out loud and rough in the still morning air. "Well then," he said, "what in heaven's name are we all standing around for? There's a spring under here that wants to run. I say, we give it back its road." And the hollow tore the dam down. It was a sight the girl would carry in her heart for the rest of her long days. The whole valley, the very people who had crossed the road to avoid her shadow, climbing up that high slope now with axes and picks and bare calloused hands, heaving at the timber, rolling away the heavy stones, old Renner working shoulder to shoulder with the boy Tom and the quiet carpenter, and men who had whispered the word witch behind their hands not 3 days past. All of them together, undoing the cruelty one stone at a time, and the girl worked among them, not standing above them, watching, not set apart, the strange one, the feared one, among them, down in the dirt and the sweat with the rest, shoulder to shoulder with a valley that was, right there before her eyes, choosing to be brave instead of afraid. That was the thing that undid her, more than anything. Not the work, the belonging in it. The dam came apart slow at the first, and then, all at once, there was a deep groan in the earth, and a shudder, and then a shift, and the high water that had been pooling so uselessly behind the wall found its old familiar road again. And it came down. It poured down the channel toward the cursed end of the hollow, toward the pale stone and the basin and the gray and dying spring that had glowed blue since before any soul could remember. The girl ran. She ran down the slope ahead of the rushing water, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath ragged in her chest. And she reached the spring just as the flow came rushing in, and she stood at the rim of the empty, graying basin, and she watched. The pool began to fill. The water rose, slow at first, lapping up over the wet ring of bare stone where it had pulled back in its dying, then faster still, climbing back up toward the brim it had held since before the town had thought to fear it. And the color came back. The gray lifted. The dimness drained away like a sickness breaking. And up from the deep, from the rich, dark stone far below the feet of every soul in that valley, the blue rose again. Deep, glowing, lit from somewhere far within. The very same blue she had stood and trembled before on her first lonely night, certain the whole town had seen the last of her. But she was not alone now. The valley came down the slope behind her, all of them, and gathered at the edge of her green, and stood in a deep and waiting hush, watching the blue water rise, holding its breath along with her. And when the pool at last brimmed full again, when the old murmur of the spring came back, that patient, steady music she had been so certain she had lost. A sound went up from the gathered folk of the hollow. It was not quite a cheer. It was something older and deeper than a cheer. The low and wondering sound a crowd makes when it has watched a dead thing called back to life, and knows in its bones that it had a hand in the saving, and feels itself made better, somehow, for having been there. The girl stood at the edge of the glowing water with the whole valley behind her, and the tears ran freely down her face, and for once in her hard life, she did not try to stop them. Silas Vane came too late. He came up the long path in his fine buggy when the dam was already down, and the water already blue, and the valley already gathered, and he climbed down with that easy smile fixed in its place, ready to do the one thing he had spent his whole life doing: to smooth, to charm, to bend a hard truth back into some softer shape that served him. "Now, what's all this?" he said, warm and reasonable, looking round at the gathered crowd. "All this fuss over a little water? Friends, you know me. You've known my family in this valley longer than—" "We know you, Vane." It was Renner. The old farmer stepped forward out of the crowd, and there was an iron in his voice that had not lived there before. "We know what you built up there on the high ground," Renner said. "We know the poison you've been pouring in this valley's ear. We know you sold this girl cursed ground for a single coin, hoping the water'd kill her quiet, where no soul would mourn. And when it didn't, when she went and made that dead ground bloom, we know you tried to choke it dead and take it back for yourself." The old man's voice rose, and it shook with something that had been a long time building. "You stood in this valley and called that girl a witch," Renner said, "but there's only the one snake in the hollow, and he drove up here this morning in a fine buggy with a smile on his face." The smile on Silas Vane's face flickered, and then it went out. He looked around at the crowd he had ruled so long with fear, and he found no friendly face in any direction. He searched, the way a frightened animal searches, for the old reliable dread of the hollow, the fear he had always been able to reach for, and it was gone. He had spent it. He had used it all up. He had pushed that fear so hard and so cruelly that it had finally turned over in the valley's chest and become a different thing altogether. It had become shame, and shame, once it stirs and wakes, goes looking for someone to lay itself upon. And it does not choose the girl on her knees in the dirt. It chooses the man who manufactured it. Old Holloway stepped forward then, leaning on his stick, and he fixed the smiling man with a long and level look. "You built a wall on water that ran here before your name was ever spoken," the old man said, quiet and certain. "Water that rises from beneath the feet of every living soul in this valley. You cannot own a thing like that, Vane. No man can buy it or fence it or hold it. You have only shown us all how small a man can be when he tries." Silas Vane stood there in the middle of the crowd he had so long bent to his will, and he felt the ground shift under his polished boots, for good and all. There was no speech left in him to make, no smile that would land, no frightened folk left to bend to his shape. He climbed back up into his fine buggy, slow, and an old smallness settled down over his shoulders, like a coat that had been his true size the whole time, only now everyone could see it. And he drove away, and the valley let him go. There was no need to chase him. No need to raise a hand. The hollow had learned the truest thing there was to learn that morning, watching the blue water climb back up the stone. It had learned that the thing worth being afraid of had been wearing a clean coat and an easy smile all along. And the thing worth treasuring had been a friendless girl down on her knees in the dirt. No one in the hollow ever bought a single thing from Silas Vane again. He grew smaller and quieter in the seasons that followed. And then one day he was simply gone from the valley, off to find some other place that had not yet learned to see him clearly. The hollow did not mourn him. The hollow did not even speak of him much. And that, in the end, was the truest justice of all. To be forgotten gently and completely by the very people he had tried so hard to rule. Now here is the part of the tale that the girl's own hard road had been quietly preparing her for the whole long way. The part that showed more than the garden or the spring or even the tearing down of the dam, who Della Mercer truly was, down in the bone. She had won. The water was hers now. The truth was out in the open. The valley stood with her, ashamed of its turning, ready and anxious to make the wrong of it right. She could have done anything she pleased. She could have kept the spring for herself, fenced it round, sold the blue water by the jug, and grown rich beyond a lonely girl's wildest imagining. She could have made the hollow pay, in coin and in pride, for every closed door and every whispered word, and not a soul would have called it unjust. Some would have called it no more than her plain due. She did none of it. Instead, when the valley was still gathered at the edge of her green, when the blue water glowed full, and the people stood quiet and waiting on her word, the girl climbed up onto the little bench that Eli had built her by the spring, and she spoke. "This water was never mine," she said, and her voice carried clear across the hush. "It was here long before I came, and it'll go on flowing long after I'm gone. A man tried to own it, and every one of you saw with your own eyes where that road leads. I don't aim to make the same mistake in kinder clothes." She looked out over the gathered faces, the faces that had feared her, the faces that had turned away, the faces that had, in the end, climbed the slope and given her spring its road back. "A woman taught me near everything I know about the soil," the girl said. Her name was Ada. Some of the older ones among you might remember her, if you reach back far enough. She knelt at this very spring once. She learned its secret, the same as I did. And she tried to give that secret to this valley as a gift, freely, asking nothing. A murmur moved through the crowd. Shame and old memory, and something close to grief. And this valley drove her off for it, the girl said. Not cruel, just plain. Called her things, ran her out. The same fear, worn by different folk, in an older year. She let that sit a moment. She could have grown bitter, the girl went on, softer now. Heaven knows she'd earned the right, but she didn't. She carried her gift away and kept it safe, and one day she handed it to a small, watchful orphan girl who had nothing else in the whole wide world. And she pointed that girl toward home, toward here, to finish the thing that fear had kept her from finishing. The girl's voice was steady now, and it rang out over the green. So here is what I'll do, she said. I'll give this water to any soul who wants it. I'll teach you how to use it gentle, so it lifts your ground up instead of burning it. I'll share the seeds. I'll hold nothing back from anyone, because that old woman who taught me had a saying, and I've come to believe it's the truest thing I know in this life. She looked out at them all, every face turned up toward her. Knowledge you keep locked up inside yourself, she said, is knowledge that dies with you. So I won't keep it. This whole valley is going to rise up on this water. All of you, together, the way it should have a long and sorry time ago. And the hollow stood in silence, taking in the full size of what this girl was offering them, a fortune given away with open hands, a deep wound answered with a gift, a girl they had cast out into the cold, choosing now to lift up the very ground beneath their feet. And then old Renner reached up, slow, and took off his hat, and the man standing beside him took off his. And then, one by one, all down the long line of them, the folk of the hollow bared their heads. To a girl who had shown a frightened valley, at last, what courage and kindness look like, living together in the very same body. The garden came back, of course, the way living things do, when you give them what they need and get out of their way. The wilted rose lifted their heads again the moment the blue water flowed, and within a few short weeks, the green was deeper and the fruit heavier than it had been before any of the trouble started, as though the very land were glad to have been saved and meant to show its thanks in the only language it knew. But the garden was a small thing now, set beside the rest of it. Because the girl kept her word, she taught the valley the water. She walked from garden to garden all through those bright seasons, showing folk with her own hands how to cut the rich blue with plain rainwater, how to give it gentle, how to read their plants the way you read a face, and feed them just enough, and not too much. The lesson Ada had carried out of this valley in sorrow, given back to it now in joy, and the hollow bloomed. Gardens that had limped along for generations grew lush and heavy and green. Children carried jugs of blue water down the long winding paths, laughing, swinging them as they walked, the way children had begun to before the fear took hold. Only now there was nothing left anywhere to stop them. The crossroads store filled up with produce the like of which the valley had not seen in living memory. Folk who had once crossed the road to keep clear of her shadow now stopped her in passing to ask her advice, shy and grateful, and she gave it freely, every time, to every one of them. The cursed end of the hollow became its beating heart, and the girl who had come over that rise with one warm coin and a folded drawing and a deep and aching wound where her belonging should have been, became a thing she had long ago stopped letting herself even dream of being. She became wanted. She became needed. She became a part of a place. She married the quiet carpenter in the end, as anyone who had watched them could have told you she would. There was a small gathering for it, down by the spring, in the gold of a soft evening, with the whole valley come out to stand witness. The very same folk who had once been so certain they would never lay eyes on her again, now standing hushed and shining-eyed, watching a friendless orphan girl become the most beloved soul in all the hollow. More than a few of them wept that evening, and not one of them was ashamed of it. Eli built her a proper home after that. 2 rooms, and a wide porch, and a summer kitchen out back. He built raised beds out of the pale stone he cut from the bluff. He built channels of carefully fitted rock to carry the blue water gentle to the rose, so she would not have to bend and carry it by the cupful anymore. And over the spring itself, he built a thing that had nothing at all to do with use, and everything to do with love. A frame of carved wood, open on every side, hiding nothing, set up over the glowing pool so that the blue water stayed there in the open air, where any soul who walked the path could come and stand and look at it. You could close it in, a neighbor said to him once, watching him work. Put walls on it. Keep it yours. But Eli Booker only shook his head and ran his rough hand along the smooth carved wood and looked down at the blue water glowing soft beneath it in the failing light. Some things are too lovely to shut away, he said. Let folks come and see it. Let the moon find it at night. A thing like this. He was quiet a moment. A thing like this was meant to be looked at, not hidden. And so the blue spring stayed open to the wide sky. And on still nights, the moon would come down and touch the surface of the water, and the whole pool would glow a soft and lovely blue in the dark. And folk would walk the long path out, sometimes, for no reason at all, but to stand and look at it. The water, a whole valley, had once been far too afraid to come near. Many seasons turned over the hollow after that. The girl was a girl no longer. The years gentled her, the way good years will, and they put silver in her dark hair, and a deep and easy contentment in her face. The children who had carried jugs down her paths grew tall, and had children of their own, and those children carried jugs too, and learned the gentle way with the water as naturally as breathing, as though it had been the way of the valley since the very first morning of the world. The fear was gone. Folk could scarcely call it to mind anymore, that there had been a time when this valley taught its young ones to dread the blue water. It seemed a strange and distant story now, a thing that had happened to other, more frightened people in some dimmer and sadder age. That is the way of it, with fear, sometimes. Once a place finally finds the courage to set it down, it can hardly credit that it ever held on quite so tight, and the woman who had freed them all of it grew old among them, beloved. Her hands in the dark soil most mornings before the coffee, before anything else, teaching, sharing, tending, the living heart of the very place she had once been so certain would cast her out into the cold. Old Holloway stayed in the valley to the end of his days, in a small house near the spring he had spent the better part of a long life searching for. And when he passed at last, gentle in his sleep, with no pain in it, the woman buried him close to the blue water, where its soft and patient sound would keep him company through the seasons. She did not stop tending that ground, and on the great old oak that grew beside the spring, the quiet carpenter, gone gray himself by then, carved a few words for the woman he had loved through the whole of his life. He carved them slow, and he carved them deep, so that the passing years would have a hard time wearing them away. And the word said, what the whole valley called poison was only a thing that no one would understand. You understood it, before us all. So that is the story of the cursed end of the hollow, and of the blue water that a whole valley once feared, and of the girl who came over the rise with a single coin and nothing else to her name. On an evening when the whole town was quietly certain they had seen the last of her, she had been told she was no one. She had been told she belonged nowhere and to no one. She had been used and whispered about and cast out and driven very nearly to running. And out of all of that, she made a garden where a garden was not meant to grow. She made a home where she had been told plainly there was no home for the likes of her. She took a thing the whole world had decided to fear, and she found in herself the courage and the gentleness to discover what it truly was. Because that, in the end, was the secret the blue spring had kept all along. The thing that looks the most dangerous is, sometimes, only the thing that has been waiting the longest, waiting, patient and quiet, at the foot of the pale stone, for someone to come along who is lonely enough, or desperate enough, or brave enough to stop being afraid of it, to kneel down close, to look past the strange and frightening color of a thing, and see the gift that was hiding underneath it the whole time. The valley had walked on past that gift for longer than its oldest memory could reach. And it took a girl with nothing left to lose to finally kneel at the water's edge. And the hollow, which had once been so very sure it would forget her, remembered her name for a long, long while after she was gone. The way you remember the first warm light after a hard and frightened winter. The way you remember the one who was gentle enough to understand and brave enough to go first.